you're thirsty. I'm Carmel Angelo. I am the CEO for Mendocino County, but this evening I'm here representing the Mendocino County Water Agency. Again, we thank you all for being here. We have a full agenda, and we plan on getting through every item. So you'll see that we will try to really stay on time as we go through the items. Also, we are taping the session this evening. The reason we're doing that is we had a lot of calls from people who wanted to attend but were unable to attend this evening. So with that, we are taping. So what you'll see is when we get to the question and answer period that if you have a question, I'd like you to raise your hand and I will be bringing the microphone out to you. And again, that is for the purpose of taping. And if we're having any difficulty, then we'll ask the speaker to repeat the question. So those items, along with housekeeping, most likely almost everyone in here has been in this building before, but just so you know, the restrooms are out the door to the left and down the hall to the right. And other than that, we're probably just about ready to get started. What I would like to do, and what I have the pleasure of doing this evening, is introducing our Chair of the Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Carrie Brown. I'm sure those of you in here know Supervisor Brown. She has been instrumental in this evening's session.
Thank you very much, Carmel. And I really appreciate the turnout today. This is a very important issue that the County of Mendocino, all its residents, agencies, municipalities, that we're all going to have to address. And right now it is Ukiah Valley. We do not know, as we move into the future, what other basins may be brought in to the act. And I just felt it was very important to bring an educational forum here to Ukiah Valley. I attended an educational meeting over at Willows the end of February. And the first presenter said, I see a lot of county supervisors. Raise your hands. About 50 of them, it was a crowd of about 150, about 50 raised their hands. He says, well, I want to tell you, county supervisors, this is political suicide if you step out on this one. And I thought to myself, if it isn't the county, who? Well, my colleagues agreed with me, and this is why we brought this forward, and we're happy to carry on the dialogue of at least one more meeting, but all of us felt that the county should step up and inform its citizens, county residents, about the new act, its authority, and role and responsibility. So I'd like to introduce our presenter. I went right to the Department of Water Resources, and they also have their draft plan out, and I'm not sure if you're going to talk about that, but it'd be important to do so, I think, because comment is due shortly. But we have Mr. Mark Norberg, Department of Water Resources. Welcome, and thank you for being here with us tonight.
Okay, let's first check the sound. Someone was making sure that my voice was coming across clearly. It's being recorded. Make sure this isn't on. Okay. All right, well, thanks for having me here. And we're happy to be here. You know, first and foremost, we've been busy giving presentations like this, similar to this, throughout the state. So I was very pleased to get asked to come here to Mendocino and give this presentation. So again, my name is Mark Nordberg. I'm a senior engineering geologist with the Department of Water Resources. I'm part of a new section that was established as a result of the legislation that was passed last September. So we're in the Division of Integrated Regional Water Management. In this area, the North Coast IRWM pretty much takes up the entire North Coast hydrologic region. I came to this section, and we're in the regional planning branch right now within the division of IRWM. So I came to this section after working for about the last 10 years in one of our region offices. There's 4 region offices within the Division of Integrated Regional Water Management. Mine was the North Coast, or I'm sorry, the North Central Region office. Our offices are in West Sacramento. This area is also, so part of Mendocino is within the North Coast, or I'm sorry, the North Central Region office. The Northern Region office, which is in Red Bluff, also has a portion of Mendocino within their region, as well as then most of Northern California. So I'm here today specifically from the Sustainable Groundwater Management section, but I also want to make sure that folks from the North Central Region office and Northern Region office within our division are acknowledged also. So today I was asked to talk, obviously, about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It was passed last September. But before I get into the details of the act itself, I want to make sure that everybody just has a general idea of groundwater, where you can go to get groundwater information. I'm going to present some details that we've been developing over the past couple years. If anybody's familiar with the California Water Plan, this version of the water plan, which was the 2013 update, albeit was just released late 2014, early 2015. And the information I'll show specific to that document for the North Coast region will be published online, hopefully in the next couple months. Obviously, we're a little behind schedule, but it's been 2014 was a pretty busy year for the groundwater folk in the department. So after I kind of give some indication of data and where that data is available online, we can get into the act. So the two big references, Bulletin 160 and Bulletin 118. Bulletin 118 is California's groundwater, last updated in 2003. And again, Bulletin 160, the 2013 update, released kind of now. Anyways, websites where both those documents are available. I want to get into a little bit about the groundwater content enhancement for the California Water Plan. We did a lot this year. We did a detailed statewide analysis of groundwater, and then took those details from a statewide perspective and broke them down by California's 10 hydrologic regions. There'll be standalone documents so you could print out, and we'll have made available the document for the North Coast. And it's a really good place to start educating yourself about groundwater, the type of information that's out there, and definitely where you can go, not only within Mendocino County, but within a regional context for improving that data. Each chapter is going to have this information. I'm just kind of asked to get through this in 30 minutes, and I tend to kind of go on tangents, so I'll try and stick to this as well as I can. But it's a lot of information. It talks about wells, it talks about supply, it talks about monitoring, it talks about aquifer conditions. Right now there's far more information in the Central Valley because that's where primarily the data is. There's information about groundwater management. We, for the first time, did an assessment of all the groundwater management plans in the state, and then did an assessment of kind of how well those plans were written with respect to the legislation. We did a conjunctive management survey that can be improved upon, and then we provide some specific references and recommendations and findings, and an overall summary of the information available from each hydrologic region. So chapter 1 is the scope, chapter 2 has a statewide perspective, and then we've got 10 chapters. Chapter 3 is the North Coast, and far more details will be available once those get published soon. We get into wells, and it goes. We did a well analysis from well logs that were available between 1977 and 2010. What we had available within the department were about 430,000 wells. I'm sure there's far more than that were the drilled prior to 1977, but this is what's in our database. 4,100 wells in the North Lahontan region, and then 108,000 wells in Sacramento. We divide things up by hydrologic region. So the bar graph on the bottom kind of shows the number of wells by hydrologic region. This is the same analysis of the number of wells that were installed per year. If I had more time, I can go into some of the analysis you can make by certain types of wells being installed certain types of years. This is specific to the North Coast. You can see and the North Coast includes Sonoma County, Trinity County, Siskiyou, Mendocino, Humboldt, and Del Norte. There may be other parts of counties that are in the North Coast region, but this is how we grouped it for the report. By far the most number of wells in the North Coast region is in Sonoma County, but Mendocino's second, with Siskiyou very close behind. And it groups these by, whether they're other types of wells, that's the orange on top, monitoring wells, industrial wells, public supply wells, irrigation wells, or domestic wells. And you can see in Mendocino County, it's that bigger blue bar in the bottom. Definitely the most types of wells are domestic wells. We also group it by hydrologic region into this little pie chart. Kind of breaks down the number of wells that I just mentioned. And then we get into the situation as well there, where from 1977 to 2010, kind of which wells were drilled in which years. As you can expect, the drought years have more irrigation wells and domestic wells. The wet years have fewer. Now we get into, and those were all wells. Now we get into a situation where we present the wells that actually show monitoring or groundwater elevation data. So these would be the monitoring wells. This is broken down into a statewide perspective, but I put here kind of the North Coast. So each of these dots show who's collecting the data and what type of well that data is being collected from. Is it an irrigation well, a domestic well, or so on? But you can see, and if I had a laser pointer, am I in anyone's way? I think I just realized I might be in some folks' way. You can see in the Ukiah area, there's not a whole lot of publicly available data with respect to groundwater elevations. The CASGIM program is improving that, but that's a slight tangent that I'll stay away from. We talk about basin prioritization, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here in Ukiah Valley. The CASGIM program, which was initiated back in 2011, 2012, it was a result of 2009 legislation. It had the department, gave the responsibility to the department to make all 515 groundwater basins in California report groundwater elevation data. We did some basin prioritization, and there's 127 high and medium priority basins. We can get into it later, but those are the basins that are subject to the new groundwater legislation. If you want to find out how those basins got prioritized, again, I won't go into it in far detail, but it's in the water code under 10933B. But it had to do with the population overlying the basin, the rate of growth, the number of public supply wells, total number of wells, irrigated acreage, and so on. The bottom part, the text that's in yellow, those are additional components to the basin prioritization that got added with the new legislation. And that requires the department to then reprioritize the priority of groundwater basins to include the adverse impacts on local habitat as well as stream flows. And this is a little more close-up of this area. You can see in this area, it's the Ukiah Valley is in yellow right there, and that's a medium priority basin. The other medium priority basin in the vicinity is the Santa Rosa Plain. There's a lot of information in the report about groundwater quality, so I won't get into a lot of details due to lack of time. We get into groundwater supply data. These charts are estimations of water use. The larger, lighter blue bars show the total water supply it's estimated from that particular hydrologic region. The darker, shorter bars next to that show the component of that total supply that comes from groundwater. Based on this, definitely the Tulare Lake hydrologic region is the biggest user of groundwater. The Central Coast is by far the most reliant upon groundwater. So this is the information that's specific to the North Coast hydrologic region. It's broken down into 3 or 4 planning areas. The upper and lower Klamath, the coastal, and we're within the Russian River planning area. It shows that a total supply, again an estimated supply, is 151,000 acre feet, and about 50% of that supply comes from groundwater. And again, it's the graph on top, or the chart on top, breaks it down by planning area, and that's kind of how the water plan organizes its areas. The information on the bottom is broken down by county. So we're in Mendocino County. Basically, it shows that 31.7 thousand acre feet of groundwater are used within the county, and that covers about 46% of the total supply. I won't go into these graphs in too much detail, but these are what we call the butterfly graphs. On this, if you can't see it all that well, the graph, or the part of the figure on the right shows the total supply between 2002 and 2010, and then I translate that total supply into a percentage on the left. So from a statewide perspective, there was a high of about 45 million acre feet used. In 2007, when the precipitation was about 62% of normal, a low of 39.7 million acre feet. We break that down into the same sort of situation specific to groundwater supply, but I'll spend a few more minutes specific to the North Coast. So this, again, breaks down the information. 2002 to 2010, it showed that within the North Coast region, there was a high of 1,262,000 acre feet, which is the same as about 1.26 million acre feet. That was when the precipitation was high. There was a low of about 939,000 acre feet in 2005. What this graph does on the bottom is kind of translate the total water supply, but then focuses more on the groundwater that's used within the region. And you can see, like I said, the low, so the high of about 400,000 acre feet with a low of about 300,000 acre feet. You can see, based on the percentages of precipitation, kind of how groundwater use goes up and down. As you could expect, when there's lots of rain, there's less groundwater use. When there's not rain, there's more groundwater use. I'll show these maps, but I won't talk about them much. We focused on the Central Valley, obviously, because there's a lot more groundwater data available in the Central Valley. But the maps going from left to right show depth to groundwater. The middle one shows groundwater elevations. And then the yellow and red graph shows change in elevations between 2005 and 2010. As you can see, kind of a zero change or no change is around the yellowish tints. Where up to 60, 70, 80 foot declines in elevation are represented by the reds and dark reds. So southern San Joaquin Valley is showing most of the red. Our goal is to make data like that available on a basin-wide scale. But again, it requires data to do that sort of analysis. And as shown on some previous maps, these areas are lacking lots of long-term data. I won't get into this, but this kind of uses those change in storage maps from 2005 to 2010 to estimate how much groundwater has been taken out of the aquifer within the Central Valley. The larger one, the bigger graph on the left there, kind of combines all three hydrologic regions within the Central Valley. And using a GIS tool the department developed kind of shows that during those 5 years, that about 1 to almost 3 million acre feet of groundwater were taken out of storage in the Central Valley. We have some telestory hydrographs within the statewide chapter of the report, but we also have some regional examples, not necessarily depicting the entire status of the whole hydrologic region, but prefer to choose some wells and then explain why the hydrograph does what it does. The D location, which is kind of the lower right there, is in the Santa Rosa area. And the story it tells is, the groundwater elevations were declining, on a yearly basis until surface water was made available to that particular area, as well as recycled water. And it shows that, when you can get a source of water that's not groundwater, those elevations are going to rebound. We call it in lieu recharge, essentially. This is our conjunctive management map, and again, it shows a statewide perspective of what groundwater management plans met the AB 3030 legislation, and which were updated in 2002 to meet the SB 1938 legislation. And then this is the North Coast area. 3 groundwater management plans in the North Coast area. The fourth one, the most recent one, which was completed last October, in the Santa Rosa Plain, isn't represented on this because we had to do our data cutoff in August of 2012. I'll quickly go through data, where you can go to get information, tools. We've got our groundwater main page. We've got a web page that's dedicated to all things sustainable groundwater management. Our groundwater information center is where you can start to get lots of historical data, well elevations. There's some online tools. Some quick snapshots of the web pages that we have specific to our groundwater site, our SGM site on the right. From the groundwater information link, we can get into this particular map. It's an interactive map. This was from a presentation I gave in Oakland, so it's focused on the Bay Area. But again, each of those dots will show a particular well, and will give you a direct link to the hydrograph for that particular well. You can do some contouring, you can do some change in storage analysis, you can do that analysis year by year, and it really gives you an idea of what groundwater is done for that particular well in the area. So this map focuses on groundwater level data. I mean, you can overlay other things like groundwater management plans, the CASGEM priority basins onto it. We've got another map on the same page that focuses on land subsidence. And again, most of the land subsidence is focused on the Central Valley. The department's recently done a report that discusses the potential for land subsidence to happen. And again, as you can expect, in those areas that use the most groundwater, the potential for subsidence is the greatest. This is one that we've developed recently. We call it our water management planning tool. Again, it's a really good interactive map. It's accessible on our sustainable groundwater management website. I can get into, I've got internet access, so let me get through this, and as questions come up, I think I'll go online, and some of these tools can be used to help facilitate some of the discussions if necessary. This is what we're making and building and making better, and we're doing this specifically for local agencies to kind of get a grasp on what's out there, or letting individuals determine, if I live here, you know, I think what county they live in is going to be pretty obvious, but what water agencies are overlying this area, what public agencies are available. You know, we've got links to or layers that show disadvantaged communities, political districts. It'll show hydrologic regions, groundwater basins, you know, where groundwater management plans are. You click on a particular spot, and whatever layers you have active, it's going to give you direct links to the information that's going to help explain some of that data. So I got through that probably not as quickly as I should have by any means, but let's go into now the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act discussion. This is the general timeline of SGMA. It starts in 2015, then it kind of takes a break between 2022 and 2025. We're January, February, you know, almost 3 months through the act. It went into effect the 1st of January. Some of the key things on this particular figure, the orange things are those items DWR is responsible for. The blue things are responsible, have the responsibility of the State Water Board. Local requirements are those in green, and then kind of joint water board and DWR is in purple. So we're fast and furiously developing the first couple things that are kind of coming up. For those of you that don't know, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, kind of a compilation of 3 bills, 2 bills by Senator Pavley and 1 bill by Assemblymember Dickinson. The focus on it is, you know, groundwater needs to be managed, but it's of the opinion that groundwater is best managed locally, and so here we are. It used the CASGEM priority basins as the basins that are required to comply with the requirements of the Act. One of the first things that needs to happen, the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies within those high and medium priority basins. GSAs have to be formed by June 30th, 2017. So we've got about 2 years to start getting those formed. July 1st, 2017, if a GSA is not formed in a high and medium priority basin, it comes over the purview of the State Water Resources Control Board, which can then help those local agencies move forward with their governance structures. Once the governance structure is formed, if you're in a critically overdrafted basin, and that's one of the things that we're working on, you have until 2020 to prepare your groundwater sustainability plan. For all the other basins, it's 2022. And where groundwater management in the past has been non-regulatory, you know, done by proactive agencies, this makes it a requirement in the high and medium priority basins. And it's those 127 high and medium priority basins that cover about 98% of the groundwater use within California. And this time there is state intervention, which is the State Water Resources Control Board. I work for the Department of Water Resources if some of those requirements aren't met. This is the legislative intent of the Act, and I won't read it, but it basically provides for the sustainable management of groundwater basins, and there's a lot to do. I mean, the goal is to, obviously I showed you some of those maps in the Central Valley. Green is generally good, red needs some better management. The goal is to get local agencies organized, get local agencies to agree on what should happen within groundwater basins, and work towards a plan using the powers and authorities that are provided to GSAs to provide for groundwater in the future. These are some of the key milestones, and it kind of summarizes the dates that we're on, that first kind of timeline slide. And again, I won't go into it. January 1st made a requirement for high medium priority basins to start working towards the GSPs. And there's so many intricate things associated with this that I'll stick to the basics and we can answer questions later. The department has requirements to update those prioritizations to include the two additional components that were provided into the Act, which has to do with habitat and surface water groundwater interaction. One of the first things that we're addressing right now is revising groundwater basin boundaries. We're putting forth regulations through a pretty intensive public participation process to establish regulations by the first of the year, 1st of 2016, to give local agencies a framework that they can start to use if they want to start to change their Bulletin 118 groundwater basin boundaries. So now I'll kind of switch gears and go into some specific Sigma implementation slides. But I'll stop. Does anybody have any, I'll take a couple of quick questions. And I kind of went over a lot quickly. So if there's anything right now that I can address before I kind of get too far into it, is that okay?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, you could go online and get the actual legislation itself, what changed, and it would go to DWR, is that correct?
Yeah, and we can get in there and I can show you where, but that's a good question. I mean, I've spent the last quite a few months reviewing this, and I'll show you a link where you can get it, but this is the Governor's Office of Planning and Research did a really good job of putting together the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is a compilation of all those three bills that form this act. But if you're wondering why we're doing what we're doing, it's our efforts to try and interpret this. If you're interested in the act, if you're interested in the language of the act, this is where you start. This is where I started. But is there a question I can answer?
You have a
quickly?
question.
Yeah.
So back on slide 7, it lists all of the various criterion for how the basins were ranked.
Right.
And one thing that's been up in the air and a slight concern is the part there on the bottom in yellow, which is going to connect potentially groundwater to surface flow.
Yes.
Can you explain how the department is going about addressing, looking at groundwater impacts and potential impacts to surface flow?
Yes. So the CASGIM program, as I said, was initiated as a result of 2009 legislation. We implemented the program in 2010, 11, 12, and it seems to be going very well. I can't give you off the top of my head statistics specific to that. But what I listed on that slide were the criteria that the department factored into establishing those high medium priority basins. The text on the bottom that was written in yellow were the two additional components that were added by the Sigma legislation. It was habitat, how those basins account for groundwater as it pertains to habitat, as it pertains to surface water groundwater interaction. One of the first requirements in the Act, by the end of January 2015, it was a requirement for the department to reprioritize groundwater basins to incorporate those two components. That could not be done. We quickly realized that the information associated with that wasn't readily available, and that we honestly needed more time to consider all those things that go into surface water groundwater interaction that I know are important to Mendocino County, specific to the Russian River. We were able to use, we had a draft prioritization process that was late, I think December 2013. We incorporated public comments. Some of our data wasn't as accurate as we had hoped. Local agencies really made us aware of that. We went through a reprioritization process in June of 2014 to now, and I think it went from 126 to 127 priority basins. So we're working on those plans and how we're going to incorporate the impacts to habitat as well as the surface water groundwater interaction. To really assess that component requires a fair amount of data, a fair amount of historical data, properly constructed monitoring wells adjacent to stream gauges would be ideal. And so I can't tell you right now how exactly we're going to address that, but we're in the data collection phase right now. There's a few things that have to happen before we can do the reprioritization. Basin boundaries are up for local agencies to modify. The regulations are due the 1st of January 2016. I can go into more details later. We then have to establish regulations by that date. Local agencies can request to have their boundaries changed. We're hearing that there are small changes. We're hearing that there's proposed large changes. We have to work through that process to then basically redraw the groundwater basin boundaries. After those boundaries get changed, then we go through the reprioritization process where those particular components will be addressed. But good question, because it's a kind of an important one. Some people are hoping, I'll be honest, that when the reprioritization occurs, they go from medium to low, so they don't have to address this. But really, there's a lot of folks that call us up. Hey, we're a low and very low priority basin according to you. We're 100% reliant upon groundwater. Why aren't we a high priority basin? And it's based on the criteria. It's based on pumping amounts. It's based on a statistical analysis. And it's not as easy as just wanting to go from very low to high. But let me continue. We have one more? Okay, that's fine.
How much water is going out of the county, and if we got a problem with our water, how much water can we stop from going down south?
That's a question I can't answer right now. But I will continue now with Sigma. So we've got a lot of work to do, and a lot of the responsibilities related to this act were given to the department on a very short timeline. We've broken it down into more or less 4 phases. Phase 1, which goes through 2017, the realignment of basins, as I've discussed, as well as the establishment of governance structures. Phase 2 gets into the development of groundwater sustainability plans. Again, that goes through 2020 or 2022. It's the initial management, it's the data collection, and figuring out if the plans that were created are working. Phase 4 then goes into maybe some adjustments of those plans, and hopefully in those areas that are highly reliant upon groundwater for regardless of the use, start to show some better reliability. As everyone's aware of, in drought years when surface supplies are low or non-existent, people pump groundwater. You want to make sure that groundwater resources is available, not only from a quality perspective, but from a quantity perspective as well. We just put out, and this was addressed earlier, a draft strategic plan. It's available online, and again, if you go to DWR's groundwater website, it's available. It's draft. It was done, I don't want to say quickly, but it was done in a manner that is not going to be detailed enough for some, but provides far more details for others. It's a draft plan. We do plan on changing it. If you have comments about the plan, you can send it to us. I think June 1st might be the deadline that we're asking for suggestions for revising it. It shows a lot of the slides that I've presented from a statewide perspective already, and really is a good educational document specific to groundwater. The slide I gave here we updated for the plan. So all those actions that are identified shows kind of the time frame that the department has for addressing certain things. And you can see that a lot of those things occur in the next a couple years. These are the general functional areas of the plan, and how we're going to implement all the things that are all the responsibility that's given to the department through the legislation. It's groundwater sustainability assessments, it's technical assistance, it's planning assistance, it's financial assistance, as well as some inter-regional assistance, and it all focuses back on our sustainable groundwater management program. These are the elements within those functional areas, but I'll go through them in more detail. The first one with the sustainability assessments, the department has until June 2016 to develop regulations for how the GSPs, groundwater sustainability plans, need to be developed. The type of data that needs to go in there. We're responsible for establishing a guidance document for best management practices, how local agencies can go about analyzing the data, collecting the data, presenting the data specific to a plan. We're under the 2020-2022 dates for GSP submittal have to do with those basins that are considered to be critically overdrafted. The last time the department made that determination was in Bulletin 118, 1980. Most of those basins are in the San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley. We're in the process right now of developing a manner to take data, assess that data, and determine, primarily based on elevations and other things, which basins in California would be considered, overdrafted, and then which warrant a little closer look, and which would be considered critically overdrafted. The importance of that is whether or not your plan's due in 2020 or 2022. I've talked about the regulations for revising Bulletin 118 boundaries. I've talked about the regulations for developing and evaluating groundwater sustainability plans. I've talked about BMPs, and we are working very closely with the board on this process, the State Water Resources Control Board, because as I said, there's a timeline and a process for local agencies in those high and medium priority basins to comply with the Act. Should they not, it's called the State Backstop Authority in the legislation, and the state board then may come in and work with those local agencies to continue to move forward. Technical assistance. I mentioned that I came from the department's North Central Region office. Our division of IRWM used to be called the Division of Planning and Local Assistance, and really the region offices follow that mantra. We can work with local agencies, working with what was then Central District is now NCRO. We've been working in Mendocino for quite some time. I've been over at the water agency back when it was the water agency. We've drilled wells in the Anderson Valley. We have staff that are helping the Ukiah Valley come into CASGEM compliance, with which it is. But we will continue to provide technical assistance to local agencies if they want it. We collect data, we analyze that data, and we'll continue to do a variety of groundwater assessments and evaluations. Planning assistance. I mentioned Bulletin 118. The critically overdrafted basins were identified in 1980. Then it was updated in 2003, and it hasn't been updated since, despite the fact it's in the code that we were supposed to update it every, in years ending in 5 and 0. There hasn't necessarily been funding for us to do that on a regular basis. There is now. So what's planned right now for an update to Bulletin 118 is do an interim update in 2017, and the content of that is being discussed right now, but more or less it will contain a summary of all the work that's gone into the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, what the basins now look like after they've been redrawn, after local agencies have been making those requests for them to be redrawn, which basins are subject to critically overdrafted conditions. If there's time for reprioritization, it'll contain that. And there's other things that are specific to the legislation that the interim update will have. There'll be a more comprehensive update in 2020. But again, we're planning for that. And a lot of those maps, a lot of the data that was shown at the start of the presentation came from Bulletin 160, which is a water plan. And there's a goal to continue that groundwater information in Bulletin 160 The two documents will have a lag between each other, so information from one report feeds into another for similar purposes. Financial and regional planning assistance. The Department of Water Resources is responsible for giving out grants and loans, as well as other agencies. But the department's financial assistance branch has given out groundwater recharge funds, local assistance for local groundwater assistance funds through AB 3030. It's about to issue the third round of planning grants for the IRWM program. And it does have, specific to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, the responsibility of giving out $100 million specific to sustainable groundwater management through Prop 1. We can get into some of those more details later. Interregional assistance, and again, one of the things that we're responsible for is identifying the water that's available for replenishment, recharge, and we're working through a process right now on how that's going to work. It'll be evaluating, Prop 1 has a lot of money specific to storage projects, improving water reliability, and then, again, to answer your question from earlier, just really figuring out on a statewide basis, on a regional hydrologic region basis, how to really determine surface water groundwater interaction.
Mark, excuse me, before you go on, would this be a good time to look at the second question about what the legislation does or doesn't do, and see if there's any questions on that component?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm almost done.
So maybe we could just...
Yeah, and I think the near-term activities, just kind of as a, reiterates kind of what I've already said. We get through this. California Water Action Plan, again, another document that the department's basing a lot of its work on, if not all of its work, are the 10 recommended actions within the California Water Action Plan that the administration put out in 2014. And then I could say I'm done with the formal presentation, and I can definitely open it up now for questions.
Okay, so we'll go to questions. So the first question, what the legislation does or doesn't do.
Now I can do questions. Yes. Oh wait, I think you need a microphone.
This may be too specific, but yeah, I'm in an area that is, say, 300 to 600 feet above the valley floor, and my water comes not from streams but from springs, and I collect it in a cistern, and then whatever I don't use goes down the hill. In 26 years, I have never run out of water. How does this affect? Are they going to are they come knocking on my door wanting my water?
No, that's a good question. So the question was, you live 400 to 600 feet above the valley. You get your water from springs collected in a cistern. How's that going to affect you? So Bulletin 118, I showed a picture of the 515 groundwater basins and subbasins in California. Groundwater basins in that document are defined as alluvial groundwater basins. And so there's if you look at, I threw a few different layers up on this particular map, but one of the shades of blue, you can see kind of out, the light blue that's outlined by a darker blue, that's the Ukiah Valley alluvial basin. If you are outside of those boundaries, the act does not apply to you. It applies to alluvial basins that are defined in Bulletin 118, but those basins could change, and we're in the process right now of gathering information from local agencies, determining from local agencies how they may want to modify groundwater basins, and we're coming up with kind of our general thought, and this would be a good time to kind of plug that process. We've been running around the state, asking local agencies. We're not necessarily asking them to tell us, we want you to do this, but we've been more or less collecting the issues. As we organize this effort for developing the regulations specific to Bulletin 118 basins, we want to know how people are wanting to potentially change their basins. And we've heard people wanting to really fragment basins to cover just their jurisdictional area. They want to make a basin out of the area that overlies their irrigation district. We've heard from areas that want to combine multiple basins or multiple sub-basins and make them larger basins. Right now some basins are drawn along political boundaries, primarily county lines. We've heard quite a few different examples of how local agencies want to change basin boundaries. We have just scheduled at the end of April. Again, in my opinion, my words, we're going above and beyond the call of duty with what's required in the legislation to work with local agencies to get their opinion on our processes. The first opportunity that local agencies, the public at large, that will have to look at our thoughts right now on what kind of information should be provided to the department to change those boundaries will occur April 28th, 29th, and 30th. We're going north to south. The 28th will be in Willows, the 29th will be in Visalia, and the 30th will be in San Bernardino. And then we'll come back to Sacramento on the 1st, and we'll do a WebEx on the 1st that anyone can sign up to watch. That WebEx will be recorded, just like this presentation is right now, that you can go back and really watch over and over again to get a better understanding of how basin boundaries could get changed. But to better answer your question, I don't know where you live, and I'm guessing with the definition of a basin being an alluvial basin, if you're 600 feet above the basin, you would be in what we consider, fractured bedrock aquifer, and most likely your property is outside of the requirements of SGMA. There have been statements made by local agencies wanting to extend the boundaries of alluvial basins into hard rock areas. Often their reasoning for that is that's where recharge occurs. And so the recharge would occur in an upland area and then make its way through fractured systems, into an alluvial basin. Whether or not the basins get changed in that manner, I couldn't tell you. And it may require, a variety of agreements between those areas. So, sure.
Very simply, this is a Groundwater Management Act. How does the Groundwater Management Act affect, in this gentleman's case, surface water sources?
Right. It does. It requires those groundwater sustainability plans to consider how groundwater pumping affects surface water sources. Other than that, I suggest you get a copy of the legislation. You can read through this specifically how the legislation addresses surface water groundwater interaction, and ultimately we're going to be providing guidelines for the preparation of those plans. We'll be providing best management practices that local agencies can use to follow for addressing surface water groundwater interaction. But it is a component of the legislation that plays a rather large component. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but it's an absolute requirement of local agencies to consider how groundwater and surface water are related.
I wanted to go back to the upland, up the mountain type areas that are within the polygon that represents the basin that was requiring monitoring. It sounds like there could be some air involved in the drawing of this. I got the GIS layer from the state, overlaid it with the topo map, and looked at some of the areas where it just is up a mountain, down the other. And then there would be places, it just seems not precise. And so I know you just took the CAS, Jim, and it looks like maybe not a lot of effort went into creating those polygons initially, or perhaps because you were referring to alluvial, and I don't know why in some areas it includes a knob or only part of a lower shelf of a terrace or that kind of thing.
Right.
And then the second question, just to put two questions on you, is when discussing the surface water relationship, this already could potentially be expensive, and that it's starting to sound very expensive, and so I imagine the state's getting some pushback, wondering why this legislation was passed without a funding mechanism, because as a small rural county, we don't have, our county is strapped already, and to think that the residents are going to shoulder all the fees involved with proving this sustainability is definitely a large concern.
So to answer the first question, or at least attempt to answer the first question, one of my coworkers just gave a webinar, I believe it was last week, and presented our best our best attempt right now that what we can make publicly available specific to what's going to be involved with boundary change requests. And he also gave a presentation of kind of how basins have been identified in the past. And they've changed. Bullet 118, again, this is the document that identifies the groundwater basins right here. Bullet 118, 1975 had certain basins. Bullet 118, 1980 had far different basins. Bulletin 18, 2003, which is this, again, changed some of those basins. I couldn't tell you the background right now on the thought process or the criteria that went into changing the basins from 1980 to 2003, but they were definitely done, I believe, in consultation with local agencies. That being said, what you just described, we're well aware of some of the, let's call them inaccuracies of those lines. We are working towards cataloging those line errors that we're well aware of, and the department has the discretion just to go ahead and make those changes regardless of this legislation. But again, it hasn't had funding to do so because it's a big process that requires a lot of public participation, a lot of oversight by public agencies. And that's what this process will entail once again. You know, the guidelines or the regulations that we have to develop is really highly public input oriented. When a request is made by a local agency, you know, that request is going to have to address a number of things, but it's also going to have to primarily address, we have made those entities that are within our basin, that are adjacent to our basin, you know, entities that could be in upland areas that all of a sudden may go from outside of a basin to within a basin, aware of the request. Those requests will be made public. There will be workshops, regional workshops throughout the state to discuss a lot of those potential requests. But ultimately it's the Department of Water Resources that will consider those, determine whether or not the information or enough information was provided to justify that basin get changed. We are going to be, I believe, as we catalog those internal changes that we're aware of, publicly available. Because again, there may be a local agency that really wants to change a particular line, but if we identify it as something that we're aware of, you know, maybe that request won't necessarily have to be made in one particular fashion. The other question you asked was an unfunded mandate for groundwater management. The first funding opportunity that we're going to have is primarily for facilitation, and hopefully in the next couple weeks we're going to have a few contracts made available for local agencies to request facilitation in extremely contentious areas where, you know, basin boundaries are proposed to be changed, where high and medium priority basins and really groundwater dependent areas are going to be required to form a new governance structure. You know, within a basin you can have one GSA formed that develops one GSP. You could have multiple GSAs that coordinate together through an agreement to develop one GSP. We've also heard that in a sub-basin, multiple GSAs are going to develop multiple GSPs. The kicker to that is they have to be written with an overarching coordination agreement to make sure that they're looking at data the same way, you know, not all making individual models that have certain assumptions, that their water budget's going to be accounted for in a particular way. So there's lots of different ways these local agencies can be formed and develop plans. Facilitation funding is going to be the first opportunity for funding. And then we're in the process right now of determining how to administer, again, the $100 million that Prop 1 provides for this. It'll be a grant process, a competitive grant process. And we're, again, going through the specifics on how we're going to require applications to be submitted to us, as well as the priorities that we're going to provide for that funding. But once the GSA is formed in a high and medium priority basin, it does give local agencies authority to raise money locally to implement the requirements, the details of which are all available in the Act.
Okay, now you're basing this mostly on the hydrological cycle to fill the basins. You're talking about wet years, dry years, upflow, downflow. But what if you have other sources that are outside the hydrological cycle? Are you going to be covering those, or this is only the alluvial basin?
For example, what?
Well, you have, like this gentleman's spring. Sometimes springs come from very, very far away, have nothing to do with the hydrological cycle. You also have deep water, primary water, which comes up through fractures, which has nothing to do with alluvial. And those sources are not in contention with the others.
So are you asking how the state's going to address that?
Yes.
Groundwater is managed locally. So in the high and medium priority basins, part of the legislation and the creation of information that went into this, groundwater resources are best understood at a local level. You know, the department's responsible right now for developing the regulations, for developing the plans. It identifies the requirements for forming a governance structure, but ultimately the responsibility for truly understanding how those systems work are left to local agencies.
How are these GSAs formed?
It's a good question. In the legislation, it shows that a GSA can be formed by a local agency. A local agency is defined as one that has water management, jurisdiction over water, or land use control. Now might be a good time to go live. This is our groundwater website. Again, it has links to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. It has links to our Groundwater Information Center, the CASGIM program, as well as Bulletin 118. Going to the Sustainable Groundwater Management site, we'll give you an introduction. We've got a link, the announcements links that kind of shows you what's active. Has a link to our strategic plan, and then the one on the bottom takes you to, we call it an interagency site. It's a site that's being managed cooperatively between DWR and the state board. But to get into your GSA question, the information that we have online that talks about the formation of GSAs is more or less here. The department was given, let's call it, no authority with respect to how local agencies are forming GSAs. Like I said, those local agencies get together one way or another in those high and medium priority basins. Let me take a step back saying local agencies in the low and very low priority basins can also form GSAs. Those GSAs can be formed by a JPA. They can be formed by an MOU or some sort of other legal agreement. But ultimately, it's left up to the discretion of the local agencies to figure out the governance structure that works best for them. From this site, the local agency's role in GSA formation, like I said, we play a very small role in that. We can provide the facilitation funding. I can point to any number of documents that can help kind of make sense of it. I brought examples of two of them. The Water Education Foundation, and again, there's links on our website to these documents. This is a good one. In addition to downloading the text of the Act, a handbook to understanding and implementing the law. They take a chapter out of it, modify it a bit, approach and options for new governance. This is a good place to start. I don't know if I truly answered your question, but the responsibility for forming a GSA is left up to local agencies.
We have another question down
Yeah.
here.
So I've looked at the map, and the property that I own is at the southern end of the Ukiah Basin, and there's virtually no groundwater there. When you go down 30 feet, there's a perched water table, and we have 2 feeble little wells that usually gas their last bit of water out about the end of August. And there's about at least 400 feet of clay and gravel that go down that are impermeable, even though we're along the Russian River. So how is that viewed under this legislation, where you've got inclusions of areas that basically have virtually no groundwater?
So right now, if you are saying your property is in the boundaries of the basin, you're in the boundaries of the basin. This is the information we have online specific to basin boundary regulations. If a local agency makes a request to have those boundaries changed, there obviously has to be some sort of justification to change those boundaries. Having some sort of scientific-based document or well logs, anything, the list is going to go on, and we'll make that information very clear as we developed our draft regulations. Providing information, that particular information, in the best format you can to a local agency who's responsible for making the request to change that particular basin.
What if local government does not form a GSA, and we're in, for instance, Ukiah Valley?
Yes.
It's in a medium priority basin?
Yes.
What happens next?
Then the State Water Resources Control Board will help you move forward with your governance structure. So what happens next has really not yet been determined, other than GSAs are required to be formed by June 30th, 2017, and if one is not formed by July 1st, then it really comes over the purview of that state intervention clause. And I could read it word for word on what state intervention is in the act, but again, I suggest everybody print that document out, and it's organized very well. And that's exactly where we're starting from, is knowing what we have to do by a specific timeline based on the information that's in that act.
Will you put our questions back up?
Oh, yeah.
I'm a member of the City Council of Willits, and our basin is the Little Lake Valley, which I believe is rated as a small or very small or teeny tiny. So this doesn't apply to us, but I have this weird thing that I always like to stay ahead of the curve. Mm-hmm. And for me, the legislation is important, but it's more important for us to take charge of our own destinies. And with the drought, of course, we're finding it's becoming more important. Now, we're kind of lucky. We have 2 reservoirs that supply the majority of our water, but because of the drought, we are developing a groundwater source to act as an add-on. Mm-hmm. So it's very probable that the city residents can start depending on that groundwater if the drought continues. Mm-hmm. But my concern is what I've been reading about and seeing about what's been going on throughout the state, where my understanding is, unless it's changed, that there is no groundwater legislation. This is the beginning of it. But generally speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody can drill a hole in the ground as long as they have legal access to it and pump out water as much as they want and do whatever they want to with it. And we've seen examples around the state where there have been auctions for millions of dollars to buy water, and there's little control from the local agencies, I guess is what I'm saying. So my concern, and maybe I'm being paranoid, but I like I said, stay ahead of the curve. My concern is that someone's going to come into our Little Lake Valley, as tiny as it is, it's our valley, and start taking our water. So I guess my question is, even though we are not covered by this act, if we can still form a GSA, and the powers that the GSA would have, can we prevent people from coming in and taking the water away from our valley?
Those are big questions. To start at the most basic level, you're a very low or low priority basin. Those basins are not subject to the requirements of this act, but should they choose to be, they can be. That would require whatever local agency happens to have jurisdiction over groundwater within that very low priority basin. Yes, they can form a GSA. Again, they've got to be a public agency. We've been asked multiple times whether private water companies can form a GSA. They cannot, but they can be, and in my opinion, should be part of a GSA. Definitely, if their mutual water company, for example, is within a high and medium priority basin. But yeah, if you had a local agency, and again, there's specific definitions of what a local agency is, that overlies your very low priority basin, you can form a GSA, and you then will be able to go down the road of preparing a groundwater sustainability plan.
But would we have the ability to prevent outsiders from coming in and...
There's lots of authorities that are provided to a GSA under the Act, and off the top of my head, I don't think I can truly say yes or no. It depends on how you organize your plan. The counties right now have got a lot of that power already with respect to, developing ordinances, reviewing well permits. What you said from a land use perspective. Can anyone drill a well wherever they want? There's some oversight from a county perspective, and I'm just talking in general, not specific to Mendocino County, to approve or not approve a drilling permit. There's lots of specific requirements that will be given to GSAs in here. And again, I can't get into all of those off the top of my head, but a GSA could, if they so choose to, restrict wells from being installed. They can, there's a number of things, and I don't want to get into the list of those right now. The only way I could do it is read you several pages out of the text, and nobody wants that right now. But in order to drill a well, you have to own the land. You can install a well, and you can pump, not necessarily to your heart's content, but you can put that water towards beneficial use. And there's a definition for what beneficial use is. But I don't know if I truly answered your question, but being proactive on this, talking with those folks in your area about, even though you don't have to, becoming a GSA, it's an option. There are other options as well for high and medium, for low and very low priority options. You don't necessarily have to follow the GSP route. Again, the GSA GSP route is required for high and medium priority basins. Low and very low priority basins can follow what has been, a Groundwater Management Act. Again, the requirements of that are in the Water Code, and they're, let's call them very important, but less rigorous than a GSP. So you as a low or very low priority basin could, through whatever governance structure you have, develop what has been called a groundwater management plan. For those new plans in the high priority basins, they're groundwater sustainability plans. So you have options. And what sort of teeth you put in those plans is left up to you.
So Mark, I just want to check in here, what the legislation does or doesn't do, the authority or responsibility of a GSA. I think we have another question back here, and then if you would like to focus on the overview of the Ukiah Valley groundwater basin, which is really our third question.
Sure.
My question is, how can you tell, this is kind of weird, how can you tell if someone's abusing their basin and then they're going to take from your basin? And also, we have, where I live up in the mountains, we have people selling water, tanks full of water, sell them to people in Willits, up for the medical marijuana these big illegal fields, but they're still selling it. And I mean, I don't have any problem with the medical marijuana and the regulated amount of plants that person has, but I mean, these are 4,000 gallons, you know, and these guys are going out 8 and 10 trucks a day. And how do we stop that? And that you're saying local.
Correct.
But then again, you know, I mean, historically, water wars are water wars. They're violent, and they can be very vicious.
Mark, I need you to repeat that question, please.
Well, it's kind of I'll repeat it in my way. Yeah, water is contentious. Surface water is highly regulated, whereas groundwater, depending on whether or not you have a groundwater management plan, in effect, is not. You know, you can put a well in and pump towards beneficial use, whether that beneficial use is, you know, supplying municipal water, supplying water for ag and irrigation, you know, the list goes on. But I can't answer your question. You know, if it's an illegal diversion of surface water, that's under the purview of the State Water Resources Control Board. You know, there are water rights issues that would have to be addressed with that. Again, that's not my department, that's the State Water Resources Control Board. But
This guy works for the
We have another
Yeah.
question down here,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move on.
so I mean,
I'd like to know if there are currently in the state any GSAs that curtail the drilling of exploratory wells, groundwater wells.
you know, there are 3 GSAs in the state right now. And I'll go back to the webpage. Again, this says what our role is, and we're basically a clearinghouse of the information. We post the information, and then there's requirements in the code as far as, you know, who can do what within, you know, certain windows. Again, there's requirements of the county's role. There's me. If you have more information specific to GSAs, call me. Right now, with the GSAs, you know, local agencies need to submit that notification, you know, after they've gone through a public process to form that GSA to us. There's 3 agencies right now that have submitted GSAs to us. They all happen to be in Ventura County. And 2 of the 3 are identified in the Act as being exclusive agencies, meaning no other local agency within that area can, you know, I'll say compete or try and become the GSA over them. So Fox Canyon and the Ojai Basin Group are exclusive GSAs identified in the code. Camarosa and Fox Canyon are coordinating really well together right now. But as far as what a GSA has said what can and cannot happen, that comes out in their GSP, which is based on regulations that have yet to be written and plans that have yet to be finalized.
They have the potential to do that.
A GSA in their GSP, I have said it wrong at times, has a pretty large discretion of what they can and cannot, what they can put in there, and how they enforce that. You know, in addition to, you know, roles and responsibilities specific to funding mechanisms, you know, there are enforcement mechanisms given to a GSA that they can put in a GSP. There's some flexibility and there's some discretion involved in those, at least based on what's in the code language, but those are yet to be determined. You know, but counties right now could have those sort of discretions.
So Mark, can we go back and focus on the overview of the Ukiah Valley?
Yeah.
And see if there are any questions pertinent to
So
the Ukiah Valley?
let me then go here. This is the water management planning tool. There's a data disclaimer, which I'll turn off.
While you do that,
Yeah.
we have one more question while you're doing that.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not Ukiah Valley. I'm from Anderson Valley, and you did mention earlier that you've been looking into Anderson Valley. And given the big impact of agriculture or the wine industry over there, and the ambiguity between groundwater and surface water, I'm wondering how you look at the technique that
vineyards use of what I call subsurface accumulation or tiling, where they put in French drains over acres and acres of land and catch the water that's percolating down through the soil to replenish the groundwater. How do you look at that water?
So I'm going to have to ask you, the first part of that question I missed. So you're asking me how I, as a state agency, would look at that?
As an agency, as someone working with groundwater,
Sure.
do you differentiate this percolating down water groundwater from surface water? In other words, they catch it before it gets into the aquifer that would feed our wells.
So it's irrigation water.
And they put it in, they save it in their ponds to use either for frost protection or for actually water in the vineyards.
So you're asking me, is that a good practice? Is it legal? Is it a...
What is it? I'm talking about the ambiguity between groundwater and surface water. I mean, I knew an old Indian man that said there's only one water. You know, the groundwater feeds the surface water.
Well,
and I'm just wondering what's that considered? Is that going to be regulated or not regulated, or should we look at it?
Oh, you should look at it. I mean, it's the how surface water and groundwater interact with each other. You know, just from a general perspective, how does groundwater get groundwater? You know, it rains, it infiltrates into the ground, and it goes down. So maybe if it ponds on the surface, that would be surface water. When it infiltrates down and hits a water table aquifer, then it becomes groundwater. There's legal determinations between both, but what you're asking is if...
The point in between is what I'm asking. There's a point between when it hits the pond and when it hits the groundwater. There's a point in between in which it's grabbed before it gets down there and put on the surface. And I'm just, you know, this is a big issue for us.
There's lots of ways in which you can conjunctively manage your water. You know, you've got and that's the definition of conjunctive management. It's the use of surface water and groundwater towards a beneficial use. You know, there are areas that really, you know, I'll use the term overpump their aquifers to give it space for, in a wet year, that water to fill back up the basin. I guess I'm kind of missing your direct question, and I'm not necessarily sidestepping it, but there's lots of ways that you can manage water. And if it's your property, whether you're capturing...
It's my basin.
Yeah,
it's my basin, and I'm just wondering how one might look at it when my well is impacted because someone is grabbing that water before it gets down there to replenish it.
Okay. Well, there's any number of scenarios where that's happening, and that's where the importance of identifying that surface water groundwater interaction comes into play. And it's pumping an aquifer system that maybe historically has fed. I'll put it in this perspective. There's gaining streams and losing streams. Gaining streams actually receive flow from groundwater basins. Losing streams are when there's some unsaturated space between a stream and a groundwater system, and then water from the surface then infiltrates down. There's going to be a need for local agencies to look at that interaction, a gaining and losing stream with respect to surface water and groundwater. If pumping actions have reduced the amount of water that might have naturally been fed into a surface water system, you know, there's science behind it, but for me to tell you if that's a good practice or not,
So, Mark, we have another question back here, and we're going to focus on
Yeah.
Hi, is this on? Okay. I have a question about the relationship between the CASGEM data and the GSAs and the GSPs. Specifically, what kind of analyses is the state going to do with that data? And will it come back to our county to be used to inform the GSAs and the GSPs, or are they going to be expected to collect their own data as well?
Specific, you asked about how did the CASGEM prioritization occur? No. Or how's that?
I'm talking about the data that we're collecting on
Yes.
Groundwater elevation.
Yes.
So that's going to the state. Presumably, you're going to do something with it.
It's all online. It's all publicly
Right. No,
available.
I know.
Yeah.
But analyze it.
Right.
Will the analyses come back to us, or will the GSAs and to inform the GSAs in developing the GSPs, or are they going to be expected to collect new data? I mean, what's the interaction between the two?
I guess I'll frame it like this. The interaction between the collection of data specific to the CASGEM program and whether or not the analyses come back to local agencies?
Yes, to inform their planning decisions.
Okay. I mean, the CASGEM program makes publicly available groundwater elevation data in groundwater basins where in many parts of the state it hasn't been a requirement to make that information public. And that's where CASGEM has been really, really good. It's required, not all the wells that are monitored in a particular basin, but a subset of those wells that record seasonal highs and seasonal lows. Generally speaking, spring and fall measurements. Those are the requirements, those are the measurement requirements that are mandated by CASGEM. Again, all that information is available online. The CASGEM data tool, other data tools incorporate what might be new data for CASGEM into, old historical data that may or may not have been uploaded in the past. We have been working with, those were some of the maps that showed where some of that data is. Big gaps in the state, and it's not necessarily because there's no data available, it's just not publicly available. I guess it'll come back to the local agencies in the form of hydrographs that are available online. So you can see, there's wells, in many areas that go back to the 20s, and you can really see when you start correlating the changes in groundwater elevations with, wet and dry years or, urbanization or different land use purposes, you can start to understand why the hydrograph has done what it's done. The federal and state water projects, the Central Valley Project, the State Water Project, were initially put in, obviously, to get water to, north to south, with the hope of that availability of surface water where there was none before, correcting the groundwater problems, correcting the subsidence problems, and it did for a while. But now there were two sources, surface water and groundwater, and you can see by some of the color shading on the map, there are still groundwater issues in many parts of the state, where there's not a lot of surface water available or where groundwater's been, overpumped, essentially. So I guess the simple act of making that data publicly available and into a database that is available for you to use as well as your neighbor to use, I mean, it'll come back in that way. The more data that's collected over time will give you better indications of what's happening where and hopefully why. I mean, does that answer your question? There's on the CASGEM website, there's a full detailed report on how the priorities were established, kind of what statistical cutoffs were used and why. So you can really go into that and find out how certain data sets were applied. And these weren't just data sets that we thought were the best to use. These were data sets that the legislation said we had to use. We've got some discretion on other things, but I don't know if I truly answered your question. I mean, it's a good question, but I think just the heart of it, as far as my response is, it makes data publicly available where in the past it wasn't.
Great. On that note, Mark, we have another question back here. And again, we're trying to focus on the Ukiah Basin.
So looking at the footprint of the Ukiah Basin, there's going to be a number of private residential wells that are going to fall into the footprint of that basin. So my question is, can you explain how this regulation applies to small private residential wells, and can you also discuss the non-substantial diversion exemption?
Well, again, a lot of, for the we're talking Ukiah Valley. It's a medium priority basin, so it is subject to the requirements of this. Some of the data in the legislation, cataloging of well owners, cataloging of municipal supply wells, cataloging of other public supply wells, cataloging of wells in general will be a requirement of the local agency or the GSA. The GSA is required to collect extraction data, and but they can choose how that extraction data is collected and disseminated. When it comes to private residential well owners, there's what's called a de minimis extractor. So if your particular property pumps 2 acre-feet or less, you're exempt from this. Does that start to answer your question?
So that's part of it. And then how would, if I was a de minimis user, what documentation would I have to prove to show that I do not have to be participatory?
Ultimately, it's left up to the discretion of the GSA, but, the current groundwater uses are estimates. And it's based on, per capita estimations. It's based on, the amount of irrigated acres you potentially have. The list goes on. It could be on, you can back out that information from electricity bills. But if you really want to prove that you pump 2 acre-feet or less, it's a flow meter where you can show numbers. On a monthly basis, I pump this much. On a yearly basis, I pump this much. And as GSAs collect extraction data, there are provisions in the Act that require flow meters to be installed on large production wells. But again, there's lots of discretion that's left to local agencies. Yeah, I think she's going to give you the...
So Mark, why don't you go ahead and, if you want to talk a little bit about the Ukiah Valley groundwater, and then we'll move over to the DWR funding and see if there are any questions there.
So this is a tool, our water management planning tool. You can turn things on and off. Here's CASGEM, which basins are monitored, which aren't. You can turn on the CASGEM prioritizations. We're here in a yellow basin. You can kind of slide the transparencies on and off as well. It'll indicate where there's groundwater management plans, and again, there's very few in the North Coast hydrologic region. It'll talk about RWM regions. This is the North Coast RWM region. Which basins are adjudicated, which aren't. And this is the kind of the water agency tool. I'll turn off the CASGEM. You can click here, and information at that particular point. I think I gotta. Yeah. I'm used to a mouse, to be honest. I don't know why this isn't. I think it's just the way it's hooked up to the projector. It kind of messes up the resolution, but it'll. And I wish I could get over, but anyway, not exactly the demo I was hoping to do, but gotta get it off actually. Zoom in. At first I gotta get, there we go. You want to zoom in to the Ukiah Basin. Okay. So these would identify, there we can go. The county, the hydrologic region. This is the Bullet 118 description. You can click on there and it would get you to the description of the basin itself, the information that was contained within Bullet 118 2003. In this particular case where I clicked, the water agency that overlies that location's, Millview County Water District. And that's all those are just the layers I have active. If you had checked every single layer, it's going to be a messy map, but it'll tell you the information specific to that point. Up here, you can plug in an address, you can plug in a city. The other site, which again may be useful, I will go to the Groundwater Information Center. I'll go to the interactive map application. I'll click on the interactive map. Again, there's disclaimers, information, and I can focus on the Ukiah area. Those triangles that come up are measurements. Those show spring 2014. You know, we can go back to 2002. And those are measurements in depth below ground. Converts those into groundwater elevations. And then this one would be a change in elevation. And again, this goes a range for the last 10 years. You know, say you click on that one. It'll give you all the information specific to that well. You click on the hydrograph link, it'll take you to our water data library. It'll show you the location of that well, groundwater elevation data. So you can see this particular well, again, without going back to the map and saying exactly where it is, you know, the highs are generally the spring measurements, the lows are generally the fall measurements.
Mark, we have another question back here too.
Two quick questions. One, on the map you had up there a couple of minutes ago of the Ukiah Basin, there's, I'll call it the donut hole. There's a spot that's not blue, right in the middle of the blue, adjacent to the city, you know, like a quarter mile east of the city boundaries.
That?
Yeah. What's is that?
So, let's see.
And I assume that's not covered by the law.
Well,
or it's not part of the basin, so what could it be?
Not part of the basin, so it's not covered by the law. Why that donut hole is there, I have absolutely no idea. And honestly, that's kind of where it gets a little tricky.
Keep zooming if you can.
Yeah, I gotta
I think property values in that little donut hole are on the rise right now.
So, again, this kind of, she's
Sanford Ranch area?
You were talking about why are these, some of the lines drawn the way they are? I don't know.
Oh, no, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, is this 200 feet above the alluvial plain? So why that's drawn the way it is, I cannot tell you.
Second question, just quick. Everything today does not apply to native property or rancherias and such, even though they'd be in the basin. Is that right?
Federal government, tribal governments, you know, I'll say are exempt from this. But it is a very good idea in priority basins to include the participation of federal governments and tribal governments. In fact, I think it was on the main, is it here? On the announcement page, April 13th, is an invitation to tribal governments, you know, a workshop. You know, maybe basically how to better engage tribal governments to actively participate in a GSA. So.
Okay, we have another question over here.
I wanted to use the Willits Valley as an example, but this example will apply to other places. But let's say Willits was a medium priority, and the city of Willits was the only entity aside from the county that, under the law, could elect to be a GSA. And in my scenario, let's say the county says, hey, it's all yours. Now, the city of Willits does not encompass that boundary, so how could they take groundwater monitoring jurisdiction outside of their boundary?
Okay. So that kind of gets into a component of GSA formation maybe I didn't touch upon. So ultimately, it falls upon the county. So Willits, for example, if it were a medium priority basin, City of Willits decided they were not going to be the GSA. They want to be the GSA. Then they can be the GSA. They're within the county of Mendocino, and I'm just kind of speaking in generalities. The City of Willits would want the county as part of the GSA. The responsibilities of how that GSA formed, again, that's a local decision, and it's how you all agreed upon incorporating roles and responsibilities into that GSA formation. I mean, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but in order for GSA to essentially properly be formed, you need to make sure that all interested parties, all affected parties, and there's a list in the Act, all those folks need to be made aware of, say, the City of Willits' intention to be a GSA in this hypothetical scenario. The county would want to be involved. How that governance structure is formed, that's up to the City of Willits as the local agency that overlies that particular groundwater basin. On the flip side, if Willits was a medium priority basin, City of Willits said, I don't want to be the GSA, it does fall upon the county that must be the GSA for that basin. The county can opt out, in which case the State Water Resources Control Board comes in and tells the city, or works with the city, I think is a better way to put it, to manage groundwater. So,
Okay, another one over here.
yeah.
It should be on.
The enforcement aspect of this.
Oh, I see a, turn it on, maybe.
Green. Enforcement.
Okay.
You get this all put together. You said somebody would have the power to tell you you couldn't drill a well. How is the enforcement couched in the Act? How is it going to be enforced in the field, especially if they are agencies such as the RCD or something like that doing the actual work?
Yeah, I can't answer anything specific to how are things going to be enforced. Again, it gets down to the general premise of the Act, which is local control of groundwater. How that governance structure is agreed upon with all the local agencies that happen to be in that basin. That's how it's enforced. Looking at the text of the Act, Chapter 5, powers and authorities, Chapter 6, sustainability plans, Chapter 10, state evaluation and assessment, Chapter 11, state intervention. And one of those chapters is probably going to answer your general question, but again, GSAs are required to be formed by mid-2017, June 30th.
Wait.
Yeah. I mean.
Okay. Enforcement in County A is 0. Enforcement or Basin B next door is firing squad. Will the state tell the other guys you need a firing squad, or will they tell the other guys you can't shoot people?
I don't know how to answer that question.
We have someone back here who thinks he can, so.
You just stood there and said that the GSA can set up and do business, but the reality is the basin is bigger than the jurisdictional area of, say, a city or a water district.
Correct.
How do they get the authority to move beyond their boundaries, their jurisdictional boundaries, to set up a GSA and make it enforced? Now, I can hear you with the county because the county has that power, but how about the rest of these agencies?
one little water district that sits in a in a ground basin area, does he have the authority to do the whole basin area?
It gets complicated, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, but you're making it sound like, that a city can set this up and enforce it. And the city, let's say Willits again, not that it's not in the plan, but the simple fact is the basin is a whole lot bigger than the city of Willits.
Right, and I won't, again, I can't navigate without a mouse. It's on Mozilla, which is, where's that, Firefox or something? Anyway.
So you end up really in these like a basin here. Let's go to the city of Ukiah. The city of Ukiah sits in the basin.
Mm-hmm.
Does it have the authority to go outside the city boundary?
That gets into a scenario where you can have within the Ukiah Basin,
you can have more than one.
There could be substantial cooperation with every single public agency within the basin that gets together, sits at a table, comes up with a governance structure, a JPA, an MOU, and they could establish a single GSA. The legalese of that document is up to the local agencies, but then I think what you're asking is what if I'm an irrigation district? You could have, I'll throw out a random number, 20 GSAs in the Ukiah Basin. Count the number of public agencies, the number of local agencies, the number of agency types that legally could form a GSA. I don't recommend it, but you could have 20 GSAs that all get together and develop 20 GSPs. The kicker to that is those GSPs have to be coordinated together, and honestly, that's not a route that I recommend. Yeah. It's going to be far easier of
one county.
Well, there are proposals that I'm hearing that a county may elect to be the GSA for all the basins within that county or portions of those basins. If they go in, there's scenarios where a particular basin falls within 4 counties.
Back to your premise that the GSA could not, by itself, go outside its territorial boundaries and enforce this thing unless they had some other legislation or the county or somebody went with it.
Well, did my answer kind of satisfy folks? It is within a priority basin, a high medium priority basin. It is. I can't tell you how to form your GSA. I can't tell you who should be on that GSA group.
You'll find out when you get to court on enforcement.
It's the enforcement is in the act. The enforcement opportunities are in the act, the code, same thing. But it's how the local agencies choose to enforce. And again, like I said, it's that would not be the route I would recommend. Fragmenting up a basin like that. By far the premise of this is coordination amongst those folks that have a stake in the groundwater basin.
So Mark, let's go ahead
cooperation is key. And so I guess to add to that and to kind of add to some of the things that we are doing to help local agencies wrestle with some of those decisions, is facilitation funding. Again, more details specific to that will come out. But one of the opportunities with the facilitation funding is a stakeholder assessment. I could tell you any number of agencies that have used it, and it's a third-party mediator. One example is the Center for Collaborative Policy, which the department's worked with for quite some time. The CCP could go out and do a stakeholder assessment, and essentially what they do is they identify all the folks that have a stake in the game, for lack of a better word. They identify all the potential stakeholders, in this case the potential local agencies. They'll identify, I'm sure, the other stakeholders as well that may want to participate. Ag interests, irrigation districts, the water agencies, nonprofits, NGOs. That is an option, and is, in my opinion, a really good place to start is really identifying all the folks that have a stake in the game. And part of what that stakeholder assessment could do is kind of take their temperature, if you will.
So
figure
Mark,
out.
that
figure out-
actually brings us to the last question, which has to do with DWR funding.
Yeah.
So you bring up a good suggestion, and I think we've had some difficult questions in the room this
Yeah.
evening. Probably we still have a lot more questions than answers. But could we move then to our final point around DWR funding? And could you talk a little bit about funding that is available, funding that may be available? We'll see if there's any questions around funding.
Yeah. Well, to start with, I think what's coming out first is RWM funding. It's the money that's left over in Prop 84. I believe this is the round 3. I'm sorry. Implementation. Don't speak real RWM, but it's the round 3 of implementation funding in the ballpark of 200 some million. There are funding areas specific to RWM funding, Prop 84 funding. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how much is specific to the North Coast, but if there's a project identified in the North Coast RWM, that project can apply for that Prop 84 funding. Again, I'm not sure how many millions are specific to the North Coast RWM, but that's the first opportunity for funding. The next opportunity is the facilitation funding, which I've mentioned. Again, that'll be how we give out those funding grants. It's DWR's role to make those sort of opportunities available to local agencies that are really going to have to make some tough decisions about the type of cooperation that's going to go into those GSAs. So it kind of puts everybody, I don't want to say on a level playing field, but it gives everybody the same voice at the table that can be mediated by a professional facilitator. Again, the details about those contract opportunities will be finalized in the next few weeks. And then there's the Prop 1, $100 million. The $100 million is to be distributed by the department. It's a competitive grant process. Roundabout numbers, starting in fiscal year 15-16, July 1st of 2015, I think there's around 20 million available. The following fiscal year, I believe there's another 20 million available, and the following fiscal year, 53 million available. So it's phased, and we're coming up with the approaches right now on how to disperse that funding to include, not only the high medium priority basins that are, required to comply with the act, but also, as the gentleman indicated, those low and very low priority basins that want to move forward with the provisions of the act. There's 800 million in Prop 1 that's under the control, I say control, of the State Water Resources Control Board. That 800 million is specific to contamination cleanup. Lots of groundwater basins have water, but that water is contaminated. That funding will go towards cleaning up those basins and actually providing for clean drinking water versus, highly contaminated groundwater, as a result of any number of actions. So those are just that's the general information I can say specific to funding.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mark on the DWR funding? Anything you've heard him say on this?
So how are the GSAs funded on a long-term or ongoing basis?
Once a GSA is formed, there are, I can't get into the details primarily because I'm not super familiar with them. It's going to vary GSA by GSA. It's obviously going to vary based on the economic structure of that particular area. But it gives, once formed, a GSA the authority to assess fees. And how those fees are assessed, that's, again, up to the discretion of how that governance structure is formed. So to move towards groundwater sustainability and those scientific studies that are required to assess certain things, the list goes on. other than grant opportunities, how those fees will be assessed locally, again, I can't comment on. Again, that's one of those local agency responsibilities, and how they assess those fees. And again, I can't talk with Mendocino on how fees are voted upon or approved, but again, lots of responsibility for the implementation of this act are placed on local agencies.
We have no answers on this evening, really. But before Supervisor Brown closes the meeting, we want to talk about next steps. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, thank Mark for coming and the work he's done with us this evening.
Thanks.
And then also we would like to thank the UC system and Greg Giusti for his assistance this evening. And Greg will be coming up talking about next steps, and then Supervisor Brown will give us some final comments.
Actually, real quick before I go, maybe before this gets started off, on this SGM website, there's resources. There's links to all the definitions in the code. If you really want to know, what certain things are defined as. There's links to the planning tool I showed, and then also related links. And this is a good place to start. We're kind of grouping them right now on those resources that the state's developing. And then there's some external resources. So a good place to start with trying to figure out, all the complexities of the act. The California Water Foundation has done a fair amount of work. The Water Education Foundation, and the list goes on. You really want to start figuring out what I'm trying to wrap my head around as well. Start by going and reading some of the resources we have available. There will be more, as they start to be developed. So.
Thank you, Mark. You essentially accomplished what Carmel and the Board of Supervisors and myself were hoping, is that we could start a discussion so that everybody gets the same information at the same time. I mean, this is a new era that we're moving into, certainly not only for Mendocino County, but for all of California. What we hope to do next time, in about a month's time, once we get calendars lined up, is we've already got a commitment from Thomas Harder from UC Davis to come up and essentially give us an hour class on Groundwater 101. Essentially how groundwater works. We heard several people tonight talk about how groundwater can be manipulated, or how soils can affect movement of groundwater. In other words, we know that groundwater is much more complicated than just a big bowl under the dirt that collects water. And so we'll have Dr. Harder come up and discuss that, allow people again to have an opportunity to hear all that information at the same time, and then hopefully at that same meeting we'll be able to analyze and synthesize some of the data that's being collected here in the Ukiah Valley and share people the kind of data that's available. So it's we're at the beginning of that stage, but nonetheless there is information that's being generated, and we'll try and put that in some kind of form. So again, the intent of what collectively the UC system and the county is trying to do is ensure that information is shared on an equal basis, so people can get it at the same time. You can go back, talk among your peers, and get this discussion going and see where we go in the future. So on behalf of everyone, before you leave, I'm going to turn it over to Supervisor Brown, but I really thank everybody for coming. I thought the presentation was excellent. I thought the questions were excellent. That's exactly what I was hoping to accomplish tonight. Thank you all.
Yes, I thank everyone too, and you all hung in here. A few people had to leave, but appreciate your interest. It is a new law, and yes, we do have to comply with it in some form, so your assistance is needed. Whether you're a governing board on a director on a water district, whether you're a municipality, a city council person, how we move into the future is going to depend on how these meetings go. And the next meeting, we're hoping April 27th, 28th. will be a time. So if you don't see something in local media, be sure to call the county's executive office, because we're looking about a month off to come back with the next session. And as Greg said, please go and talk to your constituency around you, other people. If you're a water district, city, Ukiah, different ones, take it back to your governing bodies to talk about this, because timelines are tight and we need to move forward. So I thank you all for being here. Appreciate all the questions, and thank you very much, Mark. Appreciated your participation.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.